He just keeps fixing things, you know." Deputy Rowland leaned against the door of her cruiser, arms folded, watching the old man across the street. "That's all he ever does. Fixes things nobody asks him to fix." Chief Harmon didn't answer right away. He was watching too. The man in question was crouched beside a neighbor's broken porch railing, his big hands working a piece of wood with a plane like he had all the time in the world. He was maybe 65, maybe older. Hard to tell. The kind of man whose age had stopped being readable somewhere around 50 and just stayed there. His name was Theodore Vance. Everybody in Millhaven called him Theo. To the town, he was the retired handyman who lived in the blue house on Sycamore. He grew tomatoes in raised beds along the south fence. He walked to the hardware store on Tuesday mornings and to the diner on Saturdays. For coffee, he never seemed to finish. He had no wife, no visible family, no car newer than 2003. He paid his taxes, kept his gutters clean, and once spent 3 days rebuilding the steps of the Lutheran church without being asked and without accepting payment. Nobody knew much else about him. Nobody had thought to wonder. That was about to change. The crisis had started 6 days ago, 60 miles north at the Caldwell River Dam. A domestic extremist cell calling themselves the Covenant of Sovereign Ground had taken control of the dam's auxiliary control facility. They had 3 hostages, 2 engineers and a water authority supervisor, and they had made one demand, which was no demand at all. They wanted the world to watch. They had enough technical knowledge to be dangerous and enough ideology to be unpredictable, which was the worst possible combination. They had also, in the last 48 hours, managed to do something that had the federal emergency management apparatus tied in knots. They had disabled the primary communications relay for the entire northern grid sector. Cell service was spotty. Radio was chaos. The state's emergency management infrastructure was running on backup protocols that hadn't been tested since the 90s. The town of Millhaven sat at the edge of the operational exclusion zone, which meant it had become a staging area. The high school gymnasium was a command post. The parking lot of the Catholic Church held 3 satellite uplink trucks that weren't uplinked to anything useful. There were federal agents, state troopers, National Guard logistics personnel, and 2 very stressed congressional aides whose presence no one had asked for or could explain. Special Agent Donovan, out of the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group, was running the operation. She was 38, extremely competent, and had not slept in 31 hours. She had also, as of that morning, exhausted every technical avenue available to her. The communications blackout the Covenant had engineered was elegant in a way that offended her professionally. It wasn't brute force. It was surgical. Someone who built that system understood signal architecture at a level that went beyond anything a domestic extremist group should have access to. Her technical lead, a contractor named Sims who had not left his laptop in 2 days, had told her the same thing 3 times in different ways. Whatever they're using, it's not off the shelf. It's modified, old architecture, but modified by someone who understood it at the component level, not software, hardware. Whoever designed it built the original. Donovan had stared at him. Built the original. That's the only explanation, Sims had said. They didn't buy this. Someone gave it to them, or taught them. And whoever that was hasn't been active in a long time, because this design is at least 30 years old. She had nodded and gone back to her maps. She had not known what to do with that information. Chief Harmon had been listening from the corner. He was a 22-year man, local law enforcement his whole career, and he had been politely but consistently ignored since the federal assets arrived. He knew every road, every trail, every seasonal creek bed in a 40-mile radius. He had offered this information twice. He had been thanked and redirected to traffic coordination. He was thinking about something else now. He was thinking about Theodore Vance and the way the old man had looked up from his tomatoes that first morning when the convoy rolled through 3 days ago. Not with the anxious curiosity of a civilian watching something alarming. With the flat, measuring stillness of a man taking inventory. Harmon had seen that look once before, a long time ago. He had been 24, fresh out of the academy, and he had pulled over a car on the interstate for a broken taillight. The man behind the wheel had that same look. Patient, assessing. The look of someone who had learned long ago to evaluate threats before deciding whether to acknowledge them. That man had turned out to be a retired U.S. Marshal who had spent 15 years undercover in organized crime. He was just driving home from visiting his daughter. Harmon had thought about that look for years. He was thinking about it again now. He told Deputy Rowland to stay put. Then he walked across the street. Theodore Vance heard him coming. He didn't look up from the railing, but his hands slowed almost imperceptibly, and the angle of his head changed by a few degrees. Listening. "Morning, Chief?" His voice was unhurried, like a river in August. "Morning, Theo." Harmon stopped at the foot of the porch steps, leaned against the railing post at the bottom. "You keeping an eye on all the excitement?" Vance set down the hand plane. He straightened slowly, the way men do when their knees have absorbed 30 years of hard use, and he turned and looked at Harmon with pale gray eyes that didn't quite match the rest of his worn, weathered face. Too clear. Too still. "Hard not to notice," he said. Harmon nodded toward the north. "You got any thoughts on what's happening up there?" There was a pause, not the pause of a man deciding whether to speak, the pause of a man deciding how much to say. "I've got a few," Vance said. He picked up a rag from the porch railing and wiped his hands with the thoroughness of a man who had spent a long time making sure his hands were always clean and ready. "You want to come inside?" Harmon said yes. The house was simple in the way that intentional things are simple. Nothing excess, nothing wasted. The furniture was old but maintained. The kitchen smelled like coffee and machine oil. On the wall near the back door, Harmon noticed a row of hooks holding various tools, hung with a precision that was almost military. Every hook occupied, every tool within reach. Vance poured 2 mugs of coffee without asking and set them on the table. He sat down across from Harmon and wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the chief with that same unhurried patience. "What do you know about the blackout?" Harmon asked. He didn't frame it as small talk. Vance was quiet for a moment. "Enough," he said. The design they're using isn't new. It's a modified version of a signal disruption architecture that was developed in the early 80s for use in denied communications environments, specifically for operations where you couldn't allow any electronic signature to escape a perimeter. He paused. "They call it a frequency lattice. It doesn't jam signals exactly. It replicates them, multiplies them into noise. You can't punch through it from outside. But you can speak through it if you know the harmonic gap." Harmon set down his mug. "How do you know this?" Vance looked at him for a long time. The gray eyes were steady, not evasive, deciding. "Because I helped design it," he said. The silence in the kitchen was complete. "I was 31 years old," Vance continued, "working for a unit that didn't have a name on any organizational chart. We developed communication denial systems for use in asset extraction, deep cover work, the kind of operations that didn't happen officially." He looked at his coffee. "I was good at it. Better than I wanted to be." Harmon thought about the tools on the hooks by the door, the way every one of them was positioned for access. "How long ago did you retire?" he asked. Vance gave a short, dry exhale that might have been a laugh. 22 years ago. Give or take. "And you've been here since?" "Most of it." Vance looked out the kitchen window at his tomato beds, and here because nobody from the old life would think to look in a place like this. Small town. Quiet. He was quiet himself for a moment. "That's mostly what I wanted. Quiet." Harmon absorbed that. He thought about the federal operation in the high school gymnasium. He thought about Agent Donovan and her 31 sleepless hours and her technical lead who couldn't explain the hardware. He thought about 60 miles of mountain terrain and 3 hostages and a communications blackout that no one currently in a position of authority knew how to untangle. He thought about the look in Theodore Vance's eyes when the convoy rolled through. "Theo," he said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to take it seriously." Vance looked at him. "Can you find the gap?" Another long pause. Vance turned his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table. He looked down at his hands. The knuckles were scarred in a particular way, the kind of scarring that doesn't come from woodworking or farm labor. "Finding the gap is the easy part," he said quietly. He looked up. "The hard part is what comes after." "That's a yes," Harmon said. Vance didn't confirm or deny it. He stood up and carried his mug to the sink. He stood there looking out the window for a moment, and then he said, "You should go back to your people, Chief. Tell them you've got a resource they might want to consult. Don't tell them who or what. Just tell them there's someone who understands the architecture. And then come back here tonight." After dark, Harmon drove back to the command post and found Donovan in the gymnasium, staring at a topographical map, with the expression of someone who has stared at the same map so many times it has stopped meaning anything. He told her what he'd said he would tell her. A resource. Someone who understood the system being used. No name, no background, no explanation. Donovan looked at him with the specific exhaustion of a person who has stopped having patience for local law enforcement intuition. With all due respect, Chief, we have technical consultants from 3 different federal agencies. None of them built what the Covenant is using, Harmon said. She studied him. That's a specific claim. It's specific information, he said. I'll bring them to you tonight. That's all I can offer. She went back to her map. He took that as agreement. After he left, she pulled Sims aside and told him to be available at 2200. She didn't tell him why. She didn't know how to explain it. The sun went down behind the ridgeline, and the valley filled with a blue-gray dusk that felt heavier than usual. The command post lights burned in the gymnasium windows. Satellite trucks idled in the church parking lot. Somewhere up the valley, 60 miles of mountain and threat separated the living from the missing. At 9:45, Chief Harmon's phone buzzed. 3 words from an unknown number. Back door. Come, he went. The house on Sycamore was dark from the outside. The tomato plants were silhouettes in the garden. Harmon went around back and found the rear door unlocked, and he let himself into a house that was no longer quite the same house it had been that morning. The kitchen was different. The table had been cleared and pushed to one wall. A long, low workbench had appeared from somewhere, set up along the interior wall that shared no exterior exposure. On it was equipment that Harmon couldn't fully identify in the low light. Components leads, a device that looked like a radio but wasn't quite, and what appeared to be a signal analysis display the size of a legal pad, its screen showing a slow oscillating readout. Vance was at the bench, his back to the door. He was working with both hands, his movements efficient and precise, with the particular economy of a man who has performed a task so many times it no longer requires conscious direction. Close the door, he said without turning around. Harmon did. The door to the front room opened and Donovan came through it, with Sims behind her. They had come in through the front, apparently. Donovan looked at the workbench with an expression that moved through surprise, professional skepticism, and then a dawning alertness she didn't bother to hide. Sims stopped in the doorway, staring. He looked like a man who has just seen a fossil walk. "Is that a lattice analyzer?" he said. "Modified," Vance said, still without turning. He made a fine adjustment to something on the board. "3rd-generation prototype. The ones they're using up there are 2nd generation. There are differences." He turned around then, and Donovan saw him clearly for the first time. He regarded her with those gray eyes and gave a brief nod that acknowledged her rank without submission to it. "Agent." "Who are you?" she said. "Theodore Vance." He returned to the bench. "Retired." "Retired from what?" "From a unit that wouldn't appear in any database you have access to." He let that sit. "I understand that's not a satisfying answer. It's the only one I can give you." Donovan looked at Harmon. Harmon said nothing. She looked back at Vance. She was tired enough that she had stopped filtering for protocol. "Mr. Vance, I have 3 hostages and a communications grid that has been effectively blinded. My technical people are 12 hours behind where they need to be." She paused. "What can you actually do?" Vance pulled a stool from under the bench and sat down. He pointed at the display. "The lattice the Covenant is running has a harmonic gap that opens on a predictable cycle. Every 90 seconds, for approximately 4 seconds, there is a frequency window wide enough to pass a compressed signal." He looked at Sims. "You know what a burst transmission is?" "Yes," Sims said. He had moved into the room without appearing to decide to. "This device can time the gap and compress a secure packet through it in under 3 seconds. He tapped the display. "I've been running the analysis for the last 4 hours. The gap timing is consistent. They don't know it exists. They designed the system to be opaque from outside. But from inside the architecture, it reads differently." He paused. The people who built the Covenant system were taught. They weren't the source. Donovan felt something in her chest shift. "What does that mean for us?" "It means their system has the gap because my original system had the gap." He said it without apology or drama. It was a failsafe. In case an operator was ever caught inside an area of signal denial, a way out. He looked at his hands for a moment. "I never thought someone would reverse engineer the design for use against us." The room was quiet. "What do you need?" Donovan said. 40 minutes, Vance said. "To build and time the burst package." He looked at her directly. "And I need your SIRG, tactical commander, to be on the other end, ready to receive. Full operational authority. Because when I push this through, there will be a window of about 6 minutes before the Covenant system recognizes the anomaly and compensates. That 6-minute window is the only clean approach your team is going to get." Donovan was already reaching for her satellite phone. The backup circuit, the one that barely functioned. She looked at the display. At the steady pulse of the gap cycle Vance had mapped, and she made a decision she would not fully be able to explain in the after-action report she would write 3 days later. "Do it," she said. What followed was 41 minutes of silence, interrupted only by the sounds of Vance working. He did not ask for help. He did not explain what he was doing step by step. He worked the way skilled men work, when the stakes are high enough that narration becomes dangerous, focused, quiet, inhabiting the task completely. Sims watched with the expression of a graduate student witnessing a defense by someone who had written the original theory. At one point, Donovan asked a question about the signal parameters, and Vance answered in 4 words without looking up, and the answer was complete. At 11:22, he set down his tools. He looked at the display. The gap cycle pulsed its slow rhythm. He looked at Donovan. "Is your commander standing by?" She nodded. She had gotten through on the backup circuit 40 minutes ago. She had not been able to fully explain what was happening, only that there would be a signal window and to be ready for a high-priority burst. Vance picked up a handset connected to the device by a coiled black cable. He looked at the display and waited. His breathing had changed, slower, more deliberate. He was back somewhere. Not in this kitchen, not in Millhaven. The gap opened. His thumb moved. The transmission lasted 2.8 seconds. A compressed packet carrying topographic corrections, patrol timing analysis Vance had worked out from the radio traffic he'd been passively monitoring for 4 days from his front porch. The structural map of the dam's auxiliary facility, as it had existed in a classified document he had memorized in 1987 and had no reason to believe had changed significantly, and a 6-minute approach window starting from the moment the burst was received. He released the button. The display showed the gap close. "It's done," he said. Donovan's phone rang 8 seconds later. She answered it and listened without speaking for almost a minute. Then she said, "Copy that," and ended the call. She stared at the middle distance for a moment. Then she looked at Vance. "How did you know the patrol timing?" she asked. He looked mildly surprised by the question. "I've been watching the radio traffic since they took the facility." He gestured toward the front of the house. "You can read a patrol rotation from the traffic intervals if you know what to listen for." He paused. "I should have come to you sooner," he said it the way a man admits a fault. Clean, without qualification. "I was trying to stay out of it." "Why?" Harmon asked. Vance was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bench, at the equipment, at the thing he had built from components stored in a wooden chest in his bedroom, because he had never been able to fully stop being what he was. "Because this was supposed to be my life now," he said. "The tomatoes. The hardware store on Tuesdays." He looked at his hands again. "I came here to be done with it." Nobody in the kitchen spoke. After a while, he said, "Some things don't let you be done." They waited. At 12:47 in the morning, a sound moved through the valley. Not an explosion, not the sound of battle. A series of brief, precise reports from a long distance away, like stones dropped into still water, and then quiet, and then the sound of rotors. Donovan got the call at 12:59. All 3 hostages were out. The Covenant cell was neutralized, no casualties among the responding team. The tactical commander's after-action note, relayed by her senior agent, said the approach had been textbook. Clean insertion, signal confusion on the target side, complete surprise. "They never knew we were coming." She looked at Vance, who was already disconnecting the equipment from the bench, with the same methodical care he'd used to assemble it. She said, "I need to know your full name and operational history for my report." He looked at her over his shoulder. He said it gently, without hostility. "No, you don't." She opened her mouth. He said, "Agent, you closed the operation. Your people got the hostages out. That is the report." He returned to coiling the cable. The details of how the communications window was achieved can be attributed to a technical workaround identified by local law enforcement. He glanced at Harmon. "The chief here showed good instincts." "That's true. Put that in your report. It's useful for him and it costs nothing." Donovan stared at him. She was exhausted and relieved and unsettled in a way she recognized as the feeling of having stood near something significant without being able to name it. "You're not going to tell me anything," she said. "I told you everything that mattered tonight," Vance said. He said it without arrogance, flatly, accurately. "I'll tell you one more thing if you want it." She waited. "Whoever taught the Covenant their systems," he said, "is still out there, and they didn't do it for ideology." He looked at the dormant display. "Someone sold them those designs. That's a thread worth pulling. Not tonight, but worth pulling." He set the coiled cable on the bench. He looked at Sims, who had still not fully recovered his professional composure. The younger man had the look of someone who has just read a classified document he was never supposed to see. "You're good," Vance said to him simply. "For what it's worth, you would have found the gap eventually." Sims managed. "Thank you, sir." The sir came out before he could help it. Vance nodded once. He walked to the kitchen doorway and stopped and turned to look at all three of them. The agent, the tech, the chief. He looked at them the way a man looks when he is very tired and very certain and finished talking. "Go on," he said. "You've got work left tonight." They went. Chief Harmon was the last one out. He stopped in the doorway. He wanted to say something that would be adequate to what he had just witnessed, and he understood that nothing he could say would be. He settled for the truth. "Thank you, Theo." Vance was already moving the workbench back against the wall. He didn't look up. "Get some sleep, Bill," he said. "You've got traffic control in the morning." The hint of something dry and almost warm in his voice followed Harmon out into the night. Outside, the valley was quiet in a new way. The relief kind. The kind of quiet that settles when a held breath is finally released. The satellite trucks were dark. The gymnasium lights were off. Somewhere above the ridgeline, a helicopter moved south against the stars, its running lights blinking in steady rhythm, carrying 3 people back toward their lives. Harmon sat in his cruiser for a moment before starting the engine. He looked at the blue house on Sycamore. Dark, still. The tomato plants along the south fence were barely visible, neat rows tended by hands that had once done something else entirely. He thought about what Vance had said. Some things don't let you be done. He thought about that for a long time. In the morning, Chief Harmon drove past the house on his way in. Theodore Vance was on the porch with a cup of coffee he probably wouldn't finish, watching the light move across the valley with the unhurried patience of a man who had nowhere to be and knew, better than most, how precious that was. He lifted a hand as Harmon passed. Harmon lifted a hand back. That was all. In Millhaven, that was enough. Some men come home from the long work they've done and ask only to be let alone with their garden and their quiet and the slow turning of ordinary days. They don't want monuments. They don't want recognition. They want the tomatoes to come in straight and the steps of the church to hold and the valley to stay theirs and peaceful. And sometimes, when it is threatened, they do what they've always done. Quietly, completely, and then they go back to their porch.